Okay, in the interests of time and punctuality, I think we need to start, and others can just join us as we go along. I see that the numbers are rapidly increasing, but we want to kind of keep to our word and be punctual as always. So I'm going to welcome everybody. So welcome to our Satellites of Art webinar on African contemporary arts, the cultural imperative. Satellites of Art is an art platform that empowers, connects, and inspires art enthusiasts and activists internationally. I'm Aziza Atta, and I will be your moderator for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us and being with us today. Now, we're extremely honored to have Oliver Enwonwu with us and Odile Tevie. Oliver Enwonwu is a renowned Nigerian artist and runs Omenka Gallery, which showcases contemporary art from Africa and her related diaspora. In his work, he elevates Black culture to challenge racial injustice and systemic racism by celebrating the cultural, political, and socio-economic achievements of Africans through an examination of African spirituality, Black identity, migration, and contemporary African politics, Pan-Africanism, and the global African empowerment movement. Oliver also runs the Enwonwu Foundation, which celebrates the work of his father, Enwonwu, who is widely celebrated as Africa's pioneer modernist. Welcome, Oliver. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Aziza, for that kind introduction. It's my pleasure also to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You're most welcome. We're also very honored to have Odile Tevie with us today. Odile Tevie is a director and co-founder of the renowned Nubuke Foundation in Accra, a visual arts and cultural foundation based in Accra. The Nubuke Foundation is an internationally acknowledged arts institution which supports the careers of many Ghanaian artists. The Nubuke Foundation has become a creative community hub in Accra, where informal learning, programs, talks, exhibitions, plays, spoken word, promotes art learning, reading, poetry, and drama takes place. Welcome, Odile. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Aziza. Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to join the panel this evening. Thanks.
Fantastic. So we've got a great topic, and I think we'll dive straight in there. So I know we'll have a lot of people wanting to ask questions and quite a lively debate. So I think I'll start by asking this to our guests. What do you think the expectations that we have of African art are, and how do you think they're shaped differently by Western and African audiences? So I think, shall I start with you, Oliver?
Yeah, that's all right. What expectations? I'll take the first part first. What expectations do we have for African art? I think there's a lot of expectations in the sense that we've gone through a checkered history. We've dealt with the ills of colonialism. We've emerged in African countries, beginning with Ghana in 1957. They've emerged from colonialism into their own independence and coming to their own nationhood. And of course, this has influenced our art. It's now richer for it because, it's sort of a blend, of own indigenous aesthetics and traditions with the experiences of colonialism. And we've been able to sort of form a kind of hybrid, because you see many of us have also gone through Western education. Many of us have gone through Christianity, and other various phenomena. And what are the expectations now? Something even richer. Many are, migrating and having migratory experiences which are impacting positively on their work. Many African artists are gaining representation internationally. They've got professionally run galleries on the continent, auction houses as well. Nigerian and indeed African artists, are beginning to gain stabbing amounts on the international scene. And you see the impact in the form of auction houses like Sotheby's, Christie's, and Bonhams having dedicated departments, selling African art, the continent. And then you see, African artists being exhibited, in August exhibition spaces. You see the proliferation of art fairs, 154, for instance, and in Lagos, ArtX. So there's a lot of expectations, for African art. It's just that our government is still grappling, our governments, in various African countries are still grappling, with basic amenities, and therefore they're not investing that time, energy, and resources into developing it. But a lot of it, the development so far, has been good. And I think that with technology playing a very important role. For instance, African artists are bridging that gap, that was filled by major galleries now, by, exposing their work, to new audiences, through Instagram and social media. And of course, even the outbreak of COVID-19 forced more migratory experiences to the internet. So, with hybrid models, even for galleries now, hybrid models for art fairs, you're going to begin to see African artists begin to take even more of a center stage now. So the expectations are great, and I'm only hoping that the governments, in the various nations take this into full consideration and beginning to put or help, with the structures, because it's only private sector driven at the moment. But if the structures are in place, I believe that auction houses will grow. The advent of crypto technology will be very useful in Africa. Broadband technology will be very useful in Africa. And some of these structures have to be put in place so that we can see, the expansion or the creation of a sector. The mapping of the sector needs to be done properly, especially, for instance, in a country like Nigeria, which is the most populous Black nation. I stand to be corrected. And I think that, with these structures in place, then you can have sustainable growth. We need to have art businesses involved. We need to have art insurance companies. We need to have art storage companies. We need to have transportation companies. And this will form the bedrock, that we can now chart a sustainable future for the visual arts.
Yeah, Oliver, I really like what you said about the hybrid nature and how it's being it's tracking so closely the historical developments. It really is, and really in the last 60 years, there's been incredible developments, very diverse, very dramatic, and we're seeing that with art. And then the technology has just kind of spearheaded, it's just kind of fast track things to a different level. Again, COVID-19 has had that impact. Odile, I'd like to bring you in here. So what expectations do you think we have on African art? And also, how do you think African art is shaped differently by Western and African audiences, if there is a difference?
I'll look at the institutions on the continent that are, forging ahead in spite of, the challenges that we have. Across West Africa and Nigeria, as Oliver has said, the art fair, which is 6 years old now. In Ghana, we have, artists also setting up their own institutions. We're looking in Senegal, we're looking in Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Morocco, South Africa. So there's a lot going on that is shaping, the practice of artists, sort of working with them to hone their skills, to take over, sort of practice within the continent and then wherever else they want to practice. One of the things that I'm seeing now is the bridging of work that is happening in the continent and also in the diaspora. It's a space that we haven't even begun to explore. And I'm beginning to get quite a lot of interest from the North Americas, South America, Caribbean, about what is happening on our continent. How can we connect? How can we forge, closer relationships with institutions? All those go to strengthen the practice of the artists. It enables them to have more institutions to work with, develop their practice a bit more. And as Oliver is pointing out, the ecosystem really needs to be strengthened. Once upon a time, anyone who expressed the wish to be an artist was, laughed at. What is in there for you as an artist? We acknowledge that formal art teaching started only nearly 60 years ago. So the focus has been on art, but the ecosystem of how you're going to build the system is really wanting. So as an institution, we struggle to find the writers, the professionals, the information even about our own practice is not held within our countries. Most of the time you have to go to researchers in the West Americas, who are, actively researching about our practice. And that's where we have to go to find information. So journalism, critics, curators, in Ghana, our art college probably started including curating in their master's program about 6 years ago. So it is very young, but also equally exciting, because I see that there's so much that we have to build on to really strengthen what we're doing. And very exciting to be an artist today, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. It's a very exciting time, and I feel like the private sector is just forging ahead, like a 100 sprint. There's so much happening, and we just want to kind of engage other stakeholders. We want to engage the public sector and let them realize that this is a really big industry. And it really needs to be acknowledged as that. And I think gradually they're beginning to understand it, but it's going to take a lot more sort of, I think, orientation and sensitization, and I think even globally, we also just need to keep, the awareness is growing, I think, globally amongst the specialists, like, the specialist art galleries and particular institutions who are aware of the sophistication of African art. But I feel globally, and this leads me to my next question, I feel that, the question is, why does European and North American art have a broader definition in the art world? Why do you think, Oliver, I'll put this to you, why do you think African art is kind of put with African art? Why isn't it just art? Maybe from the continent, or there can be a description saying where it originates from, just like we find out art from a particular Norwegian artist, so he's originally from Norway, but we just have the art piece, the identity is not the dominant factor. So I'd like to hear both of your views on that.
Okay, I think that, does it have a broader definition? Perhaps. Well, that's arguable, because African art, of course, is dynamic and has changed. Art itself is a cultural entity, and because of that, it keeps changing. I'll just go back a little bit, if you don't mind, to some of the influence that Western art has had on African art. I know that the events of the Berlin Conference, I think, of 1884, if I'm correct, had its major impact in African art, where you saw Western powers come together and divide Africa for its spoils. They came to Africa and colonized Africa. You had the English-speaking Africans like Nigeria, you had the Francophones, you had the Portuguese-speaking, and they had their various impacts. And one of the major impacts was the decimation of our, so to speak, of our own traditional beliefs and cultures, and that's where you saw those great geometric forms of African art begin to disappear, culminating, for instance, in the sacking of the Benin Empire, or the Benin Kingdom rather, in 1897. And that affected our art. And then we saw the advent of Christianity, making sure that some of these religious images, were burnt, and because they were looked upon as idols. Now, that Berlin Conference, one of the major aims was to collect specimens for Charles Darwin's Museum of Natural History. And therefore, they came to Africa to collect some of our beautiful art pieces to be put in museums. Now, these pieces were not necessarily for aesthetic purposes to be enjoyed in museums, but they took away something from us. There was a break, in that system of production, and for me, that's the major impact that Western art or the Western influences had on Africa. And the second one is the patrons. And up till today, you still see the West, dictating our stylistic development, because we find artists, pandering to the dictates of Western patrons. And that has changed our art. Our art has sort of gone through some sort of aesthetic filtering. And that's why some of our artists, have begun to, exhibit in August exhibition spaces and are being represented because they've gone through some sort of aesthetic filtering. Now, that I'd say is the major impact. The stylistic changes, because of that aesthetic filtering, and of course the patronage, where you find artists begin to, see their art as commodities, because now it's exchanging for money. So that's, for me, is the major impact. Now, what has the impact been on European or Western art? The impact has been such that there's been the creation of modern art, which essentially, at the turn of the 19th century, is a break from, academic realism, and that's why our art is very important to the likes of Picasso, who adopted, some of these geometric forms, and then you see, what he did with modern artists like Paul Cézanne, Picasso and the likes of them with their Cubist mannerisms, they brought a whole stylistic change. Now, the Africans themselves have imbibed modernity in their own terms, but why it looks like, we're being pushed to the peripherals is because, unfortunately, which is an aberration, African artists were dismissed as pale copycats, forgetting that their art, the traditional forms of African sculpture influenced directly modern art, as it were. So modernity wasn't recognized in other parts of the world apart from the center, Europe, and of course, North America. So that has been the major difference. And that, definition, African art, was meant to be something that was subservient in that sense. It was meant to define our art as primitive, while the likes of Picasso refined it, and took it into modernism. So it's just in recent times that modernity is being considered in other parts of the world. It's a slow start, but it's changing. Things are beginning to change now with African art beginning to rise. But you will find out that, an artist like Enwonwu, for instance, when you compare him to his peers like Picasso, for instance, as early as 1946, they were exhibiting in the same museums in France, in Paris, for instance. But there's obviously a major price differential between their works, and that is an anomaly. And it's only because, an modernist artist like Enwonwu hasn't been giving his proper due, which is to be written properly into the Western canon of art history. So that is why you find, our art, being classified in a niche way, as opposed to being accepted more broadly. So that is what I'd submit.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting point. Again, we're going back to historical narratives and power dynamics and sort of decolonization in terms of approaches. And I think it's gradually being deconstructed, but obviously some of those issues are still there, which I think with the time, hopefully it's becoming broader, and just art is appreciated for the substance rather than
and also to add that even in contemporary times, you find that our art today is the contemporary artists are considered even more, considered even higher in status than the modernist. And it's almost as if African modernists are kind of skipped over. It's almost as if the contemporaries now are working, in a vacuum without considering that they had a beginning with the African modernists, because they were dismissed earlier on in their careers as pale copycats of the European modernists.
Yeah. So there's a need to kind of make sure all the tracks are in place and people are acknowledging where the roots come from. And I think that's a very valid point. I think even within the art industry on the continent, there needs to be that kind of acknowledgement of the history and the origin and the source. And I think that just needs to happen through raising consciousness and awareness. I think a lot of people just aren't aware, especially all the younger artists are not aware, actually. Odile, what would you say about this?
I'd like to talk about the curriculum when we're talking about our art. It's quite important that we pay attention to what is being taught. Oliver was talking about the fact that a whole lot of our artifacts were taken away and put into museums. So even teaching about this art forms from like the 17th, 18th century is missing. And like the modernist is also missing from the curriculum. So that is a problem. Owning that knowledge is missing from our own context as well. I find that the reasons why our institutions are important, because we are the ones who need to be pushing for this information to be even researched and written about. And then when we have that, we can sort of lobby for the state to find a space for it in the curriculum. But once it's absent from the curriculum, we are all ignorant of what our history is. And, we are not able to stand on any platform to talk about who we are if these pockets of information are missing. What else was I going to say? I was going to talk about the curriculum, quite importantly, the knowledge base that we need to build, which affects everybody, and it's quite key.
I know Nubuke has various programs. Is this one of the programs that Nubuke is developing?
We haven't, we are 15 years old, and I think this process is quite slow. Recently, I think I was invited to assist with the curriculum building of junior schools, and I've been away, so I haven't actually responded to that, but I think it's a step in the right direction. These sort of things take time. And I think we all know that the government always comes up behind private institutions and private initiatives. So when the opportunity arises, I think we take it up and then see how we can infect changes which are quite necessary. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, definitely. I think the private sector leads the way, and then after a while, the government hopefully, acknowledges and accepts that this is something important, something good, and people are responding positively to it. Mm-hmm. But it's very key, actually. It's a very valid point about how having it in the curriculums, the educational curriculums, is actually really important for people to understand how things flow. I wanted to ask both of you about the extent to which cultural, the cultural imperative is the cultural imperative, and by that I mean, when people are expressing themselves artistically, is it a prerequisite for making, curating, or seeing art from the continent? Because you find that people have a certain expectation of what they're going to see, and there's a positive aspect in that. Of course, people, it's whatever the artist wants, they want to, they feel inspired to express this aspect or that aspect. But I just want you to talk to us about whether there is an issue with people limiting themselves to that, or people feeling obliged to limit themselves to that, and what your insights are about that. Odile, perhaps you want to take the floor.
It's quite an interesting conundrum to be in. I mean, in the first place, I'm looking at a numbers game where a lot of what we are consuming is coming from a different world. So Nubuke Foundation is like, we need to focus and bring the lens through which we are consuming our own art must be our lens. So that's one. But you can't ignore the fact that this world that we're living in, there's influences coming not only from our country, it's coming worldwide. I mean, so an artist is not only going to be expressing themselves based on their context, which is like where they grew up, or what their family background is, and so the influences are coming from everywhere. But the point is that you always find that element of the identity somewhere, but you can't really be forcing that to be what drives the curation or production. I think artistic license gives you that wide field in which to play, but for me there's always that I say that our foundation is there to support Ghanaian artists. What is that definition? We kind of say somebody who's grown up and lives in Ghana, but you can tease it, and to such an extent. But I find that it's quite a difficult space to play in. But in the main, we're looking for our voices to be heard above the voices of mainstream Western institutions, Western art. everywhere else because we haven't had that opportunity to showcase what we do. And so whatever it is, we think that that's what we are driving.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really about authenticity because, I mean, art is a means of expression and communication. And it really is an alternative means of community, alternative is another means of communicating. It doesn't have to be necessarily limited by anything. It's really about what the artist is thinking about and feeling at the time, regardless of the artist's identity. Oliver, I'd like you to come in here. What are your views on this on this issue?
My views, I'll give a general view first of all, and I'll end up with a more personal view. I think that historically, I always like to look at things historically because anything that's going on now always has a precedence. I think that pre-1950, maybe 1957, when Ghana was the first African country to emerge to gain its own independence, I think that it was important for artists to create work that championed the aspirations of their people, in defining themselves as a nation. And that's why you'd see many public sculptures, trying to bring people together, trying to create that spirit of unification amongst the various people. And when we got into the post-colonial era, that began to change, especially with increased globalization, where you had trade between countries, shared histories, and artists started to define themselves as all citizens. They didn't want to be classified as African artists. So their ideals changed. They began to take on various broad-ranging themes. And here today, you see artists working on the environment, working on gender, working on equality amongst people. You see so many world issues that are pressing that artists are beginning to find solutions to. And for me, that is the relevance of an artist. But I think that there shouldn't be any cultural imperative in that sense, because colonialism itself was an aberration in the sense that you have a very diverse continent with various ethnic groups. I think that, and I stand to be corrected, over 800 different languages are spoken across Africa. And we were squeezed into one continent, and we were squeezed into 54 countries. So I think that that itself is an anomaly. So you can't expect there to be one way of looking at things, because you have peoples that are cut across with different languages and different ways of doing things. So there cannot be any true cultural imperative of an African way of doing things. I think that African artists are united not by their themes, but they're united by their attitude towards making art. For instance, the apprenticeship system, which, is being revisited even now, maybe what they draw from the geometric forms of African sculpture, but I think that there isn't one visual vocabulary for African art, and it cannot be so because we're very diverse. Now, it just depends now, artists created how we respond to various stimuli, but I think that, and this is a personal point of view, which I said I'll end up with, is that I think that now more than ever before, I think that we need to draw strength from our diversity. And it's important, that in creating art, we've got to find some relevance. So it may not necessarily be in the themes, but we must understand the responsibility of that privilege, because we're creating, we're touching people emotionally. So it is extremely important, to change the narrative of our continent, which is common to all of us, and indeed Black people all over the world. And where we have negative stereotypes of corruption, where we have negative stereotypes of poverty, which are circulated in mass media, I see no reason why the African artists should not embrace, it and change the narrative, because in changing the narratives, you're affecting or impacting positively on several generations to come, especially when you take into consideration that 1 in every 5 Black people, or 1 in every 10 people are African, or when you take into consideration that the continent, is going to be made up of about 60% youth. So it depends. I mean, Odile has spoken of education. How are we educating those coming after us? And I think that is really what the African imperative should be right now. What stories are you weaving, to change these negative stereotypes? And if the positive stereotype about Africa is about the safari, and the negative stereotype is one of corruption and 419. What are we doing to change that narrative? So that, for me, is the responsibility of privilege.
Absolutely. I mean, I think sometimes people don't really. I mean, this is where it really needs to be brought into the curriculum, like Odile was saying as well. All of that, I completely agree with you. This is why people don't understand the power of art. It's power, it's communication,
Yes.
it's language, it's language in visual form. Yeah. I think people need to really, internally embrace that and really start to ensure that others really understand that and it's actually seen from that perspective. I think historically it was. I mean, historically in African culture, art was very powerful.
Yes.
It was used to express so much of the African spirituality. I mean, but we've kind of lost that, and we need to kind of
all
get
of
back.
that. Yes.
And it's interesting what you were saying about. I liked what you said about the fact that the reality is that the art expresses the social, economic, or political context, and how as that is changing, regardless of where people are from, people are going to be expressing elements of that. That is
Absolutely.
the reality. And so, but no one's going to tell your story. You have to tell your story yourself.
Absolutely.
And that leads me to my next question before we open the floor to Q&A. I mean, Odile, you've touched on this, so I'd like to elaborate it a bit more. So what initiatives are taking place to change our own narratives? What initiatives do you feel are taking place, or more should be taking place?
I mean, one of the important things is that we recognize those who are in the space and working with the artists to take control of our own our own conversations. And I think what we have to do more of is to work together, because I find that working in Ghana, I don't do too much with other countries in the West, even in West Africa. We are aware of each other. We know that we are all sort of doing this hard graft to support our artists and put them out there, support them, help them to develop their practice a bit more, create opportunities for them to showcase their work. But I feel we need to do more together, because that is when the voice is strengthened. What I find is that those who are more likely to talk about us, or we are even going out there to hear information about ourselves, not from the continent, but from press outside, journalists outside, critics outside. People are writing about us, and that needs to change. And it will only change when the institutions are all working together and sort of strengthened by the work that we're doing and sharing which artists are doing what, and then become this force, which means that when we speak, everybody else would come to us to hear from us. But at present, I find that there's individuals all over, not from Ghana or not even from West Africa, who are beginning to come in and take control of the narrative about what we are doing. And that I find is dangerous, because what is the point of all the work that we are doing when somebody else, like you're saying, who is a gatekeeper somewhere else, decides what is important, what to talk about, who's out there, who is exactly who's important. We need to decide who is important. We need to talk about it, and we need to share it. So that's, for me, is quite key. Sorry, what else were you asking?
Okay, I can add to what Odile said.
Aziza, you're on mute.
Okay. Sorry about that. I thought, why aren't they responding to me?
Okay. I was going to add to what Odile has said. I wouldn't reiterate her points, because she's made very powerful points. But I'll add another point, which I think is also important. In the last couple of decades, I mean, our modern art history is very young, because essentially it takes off from the point of independence, which is for many African countries in the early 1960s. But I see something that gladdens my heart. I know in the past, many advocates, have always agitated for the government stepping in. And it can't always be the government. It can't always be the public sector. The private sector has done its bit. What about the content producers themselves, the artists themselves? And last couple of years, maybe in the last 2, 3, 4 years, we are beginning to see a new vanguard of artists creating work. And when you look at it historically, you see that, Black people have sort of been subservient in Western art history because they are seldom represented. And when they're represented in subservient positions as slaves and all of that. Now you see, powerful portraiture emanating from the African continent, where you see this vanguard of artists creating, images of confident Black people, celebrating Black excellence, celebrating Black personalities, turning the gaze back on the viewer, showing us in confident, assertive gaze. And I think, that will go a long way because it documents the new African, one who is confident, one who is assertive, one who knows his beginnings, where he's coming from, and is able to chart, his progress for the future. So I think that content is extremely important because it also becomes research, for future generations to come. And then we have a document, that tells, people, of how we lived our lives, at this period in time, who we are as a people and where we're going.
I completely agree. I think that the documentation, the recording, the archiving, the creating material for people to refer to, so that there is a written history. There's always been a history, but sometimes it was lost in the oral cultures. Is critical, and one with research, one can still get, get that together, which is what a lot of people are trying to do. But there's questions coming in. I think I'll leave. I could keep asking you questions all night. So I'll leave Louisa to sort of start to fielding the questions that have come in from viewers. Over to you, Louisa.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a really lively discussion, and there's so much to think and ask. The first question that we have is actually about satellites of art, because obviously we're a platform that are bringing together artists from underrepresented countries. So the question is, do you welcome this sort of initiatives? Do you welcome the fact that Satellites of Art brings artists from underrepresented countries together to make art from these countries more visible to the European and North American market, and to advocate for alternative arts education? And it can be either of you.
I think you're speaking a bit too fast, and I didn't quite get.
Sorry. Yeah, so basically, do you welcome initiatives that are bringing together artists from underrepresented countries and making them more visible to European and North American markets specifically, and for alternative arts education?
For me, it's not about showcasing to North America or European markets. It's about showcasing full stop. We also need to educate ourselves in Ghana, in the continent, about who we are, what we're doing. But I definitely welcome, because I feel that we have been so concentrated in doing what we need to do in Ghana that we even forget that across the Atlantic, in the North Americas, we have similar situations with Black Americans. In South America is the same. So it's important that we are reaching out, creating opportunities, for me, exchanges, especially platforms that artists can have residencies, exchanges, showcase their work, meet new audiences, talk about their practice, find ways in which there are synergies within different contexts. So that for me is quite important, yeah. And that is ongoing at Nubuke already, yeah.
What about you, Oliver?
Well, if I'm going to add to that, I'll just say that it's very important work that Satellites of Art is doing, because it helps to provide a searchlight on maybe areas or regions of the world that have not got the kind of visibility, especially when the art books, are read in the art capitals of the world. So it's very important that you turn a searchlight to consider, contemporary developments in other areas and regions of the world. As Odile has said, it's very important for residencies, exchange programs. I'll add mentorship. I'll also add that it's extremely important work that they're doing. So I doff my hat to Satellite Awards, and I can only wish them well on this endeavor.
Yeah, thank you. We got another question from Anita. So they say a lot of African communities have their unique art, where indigenous have lost their zeal for creating. Art was not always seen as a hobby in Africa. Artists were respected and cared for. How can we get that reverence back and expand the ecosystem by encouraging the uniqueness of the past? Either of you can feel free to answer that question.
Oliver.
Well, I'd say that first of all, discussions like this are very important, where we begin to trace our roots back to the continent, where we begin to discover spirituality all over again, because there was a very strong break with the advent of Christianity. There was a very strong break with colonialism. So right now we're going through a process of decolonization. It has always been a different way for Africans to accept modernity, which is a sort of sampling, because with modernity, came other ills like colonialism, as I've mentioned. But the African is able to look at modernity and take what he needs. And that's why, I think our art has been enriched, in the sense that we've taken easel traditions, Western techniques, and sort of created our own language, so to speak, in the sense that we have our own art that, is a hybrid of those indigenous traditions to us and Western techniques of representation, so talks like this are extremely important. Exchanges are extremely important. The curriculum, as Odile spoke of earlier, is extremely important. We have Africans that can't even speak their native language today. We are disconnected from our history. We need to start reimagining our own history, and telling it the way it's supposed to be. For instance, the Benin artists working today, they imagine the history of the triumphant Oba. They don't see that their Oba was sacked in that sense by the British in 1897. They retell their history another way. Another thing that we need to do is, because I think we've spoken about this earlier, is create the parameters by which our own art is judged. We must not necessarily listen to the dictates of other people in defining, our own parameters for our own art or visual culture. I think it's very important. We need to define our own parameters. We need to, tell our own story, and I think that our art historians are beginning to come of age, but then they need that support to be able to get, it's not just writing a book, but it's distributing your text. And I think the internet, has provided a level playing field, so it's important that we embrace technological changes. So that for me is another strategy. We need to embrace technological, developments, in getting our art out there. We need to tell our own stories. We need to reconnect to our history, through the education curriculum and all of that, and a retelling of our own history. So for me, these are vital first steps. And then we need to map our history, our art sector, to find out areas of investment and collaboration. I think these are extremely important so that we can build public and private sector partnerships. Then we need to create places where people can come to see our art. Museums, they're really lacking in Africa. So you find out that if you want to understand your people, you go to the British Museum. What happens to, the museums here? What's happening to the museums here in Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance? So there's a disconnect somewhere. And until we bridge these gaps, then we're still going to have these problems, Thank you.
I mean, I'd add that we need to actively have interventions as well. If you look at the exquisite brass works, textile, clay, which already exists within our traditions, I find that any mention of any of these materials in the contemporary space. It's like, nah, this is craft. This, we can't include this in contemporary practice. My question is why? This is, this is the medium that we've always worked with. If today we want to bring it into contemporary practice, why not? There's all kinds of things being included in contemporary practice today, engine oil, formaldehyde, so why is it that when it's something which is already part of our tradition, we're frowning on it being part of our contemporary practice? So we need these interventions also we need to be quite careful that we also not perpetuating this, oh, this is contemporary practice and this is traditional. They need to go together. They need to meet somewhere. We need to merge it. And so these interventions where you're encouraging artists who want to work with fibre, who want to work with textiles, who want to work with brass, go back to look at, what was, were the traditional practices before. How do you bring technology into these practices to sort of hone and bring up new materials into your work? Those things need to be encouraged. And as Oliver is saying, I feel it's important to have community spaces that through which people can sort of learn about what we do. Even if it's not a major museum in the city, it needs to be local. So anytime you visit any community, you find that this is as work, and you find opportunity to work with a master or find a master who can talk to you about what they're doing. And that is the only way we can, work quite effectively at bridging the gap. So patronage of our own practices and not embracing it and not rejecting it for something that we feel is not acceptable because it's not coming from a Western canon. I think that's quite important for us as well.
Yeah,
I agree with you, Odile. Yes. I just want to add in support of what Odile has said, that you can see effects like that in the value ascribed to traditional artworks like those that came from the ancient Benin Kingdom and the Nok terracottas. You will find out that today, works that are created, for instance, in Benin, using the same archetypes, are not given the value because the West says that, value is ascribed only to those works that were actually used pre-1897, and they must have been used in ritualistic purpose. So it doesn't encourage those working in Benin who are using these ancient methods of creation, who have also imbibed contemporary means of creating art, and created a sort of hybrid in their techniques and processes. So I think that is very important, and that goes to support my earlier point that, who is responsible for ascribing value, to African art if the Africans are not giving a say themselves, and even the collectors and the patrons who support this industry, are not also giving that say. Because if they collect work today from Benin, for instance, that are created just the same way that the ancient archetypes were, they are almost valueless compared to those that were stolen away in 1897. So what parameters were used to judge that? So these are some of the things that wouldn't encourage, local or indigenous production, especially production that is seemingly more improved because, of course, technology keeps improving.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. I mean, I know there's quite a few questions here, Louisa, so I'm just going to quickly add my 2 cents. And I think also there's a mindset as well, and people not allowing external definitions to define, to be the norm. It's just someone's opinion. People themselves can take responsibility for how they define things, and also creating, diverse markets, diverse economic markets for the artwork, from locally to internally to regional to international. Where there's the diversity, then people then gradually begins to get momentum and value even within in the local area, and I think that's key. Yeah. And this is again going back to Odile's point about the education. It's only when patrons also locally, patrons globally actually start to understand the history, understand the value, understand all these issues we're talking about, that there will be that patronage, you know, so that we go back to education again. But anyway, I'm going to hand over to you, Aziza, because I know we've got a couple of questions here. So.
Yeah, just to add just a bit more about that whole idea of having local initiatives. Satellites of Art, we also do like joint exhibitions in West Africa. So it's all about like, yeah, having like our events in Berlin, but we also have events there. So it's all about having like a sort of balance. There's quite a few questions. So I'm going to try to merge them together. Two of them are basically about privilege and how obviously to be an artist, often you have to come from a background of privilege. You cannot see it as a priority if you're in a situation of poverty. And this is the case with many young people. So how can we encourage more people to pursue their creativity, even if they are coming from like a difficult situation that is not allowing them to do that?
I'd say that our institution was started primarily, you know, to support the artists. Probably at the time that we started, maybe less than 5% of graduating students would continue into full-time practice. So why is that? And you know, and things have changed 15 years later, where even high school students who don't have the opportunity to go into university are renting tiny little spaces and producing. So things are changing, but you know, it is a very slow process because the ecosystem is not very institutions, patronage. Unfortunately for us, I'd say majority of our buyers are still not even coming. You know, if anybody's going to be making money from their practice, we need to hone the skills of patrons locally in our countries, because unless that is happening, we are constantly looking out for who's going to come in and support the artists. And it's a very slow process. We started off not just to encourage artists to produce, to show their process, to be engaged in conversations, to talk, you know, because we felt that if we're talking about selling, we probably are going to lose them. We have to talk about how do you develop and become confident and authentic as an artist. When you are that, then you can choose whatever path that you want to. And I must say, in 15 years, we are now seeing so much, you know, 6 years ago, we had a commercial gallery starting up, and, you know, they've just been showcasing Ghanaian artists since then. So it's a slow process, but, you know, the education is important, the ecosystem is important, the patronage is important, and we need more people locally who are supporting artists. Institutions that support artists are very, very few. So this sort of process of even working with an artist outside of the formal system, which is very, very key, it needs support. We're not getting that in our country. So it's just, you know, as much as we can do. I mean, I must say also in the last few years, artists themselves are setting up institutions to support fellow artists, which I think is a very, very good thing, because they are becoming mentors of artists themselves and showing them, you know, how to you know, improve on their work. And so the more people who are existing within the space, helping the artists with their practice and to develop their skills, the better. So yeah, I think it's a slow process, but we are all very committed to doing that. Yeah.
I'm just gonna do one last question because the time is almost up. So this one has to do a little bit with, I guess, the idea of tokenism. A lot of, you know, Western art institutions are starting to bring artists from Africa, but sometimes we don't know if these intentions are actually genuine. So the question is, could these art donors and funders that support art within Africa resort to genuine agendas and desires? And can we even tell if these agendas are genuine?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that one of the things that makes African art interesting or attractive rather, is that the entry point is extremely low. I mean, African artists that just as experienced as the international counterparts. I mean, maybe in terms of the number of years they've been practicing, for instance, as one example of a parameter, you know, you find that their price points, you know, differ very sharply. And I think that, you know, for a lot of the collectors, you know, collecting African art, although of course it's very rich. I mean, I've spoken about the experiences that we've had, you know, in Africa, you know, that has formed a hybrid identity in our works, you know, but you find that despite that interest, or, you know, that the main attraction is that it's too cheap, you know, compared to what you can find with international counterparts. And I think that in that sense, then you can speak of tokenism in that sense, you know. Are their agendas real? I know that some galleries, of course, you know, would do well with African artists, but there are some that are strictly profit-oriented, they damage the careers of artists. You know, many galleries that support these artists are commercial in nature, are not seeking to present their artists in museum shows, which I think is the epitome or the peak of an artist's career. You know, and they're killed at the commercial level. And of course, you know that the art world is bedeviled by its opacity, which is a problem, you know, because prices are not out there and you can't really tell what exactly is going on, you know. And of course, it has its problems in the sense that, you know, sensationalism also thrives in the art world. So are the intentions real? You cannot exclude tokenism, for instance. And a lot of people who have profited from art in Africa, for me, are not giving back to the system as they should.
Mm.
Anything you would like to add to that, Odile?
Well, you know, there are people with the good intentions, and you know, like, you know, we have the 154 fair, we have ArtX Lagos. In the last 6 years, they both sort of created opportunity for more artists really to be showcased. I mean, you can't, it's difficult to tell those who are in there for pure commercial purposes, and you know, that's the world actually. We can't not find ourselves affected by how the world moves. And that's one of the things I always say to artists: you need to be savvy about what's going on. Not everybody who comes to you is there for your interests. And what you need to be able to do is to be discerning and find out who is there for you, you know, and have a clear focus of where you want your career to go. Because if you don't have that, you just find yourself maybe with your, you know, I don't know, years down the line, really not sure where you were. Years down the line, maybe just found yourself in a whirlwind, you know, pandering to somebody else's whims. So yeah, there are different people in the market, and it's about being savvy and doing your research, I guess. And yeah, that's it.
And I like to end with a note of controversy. I think
controversy is always welcome.
Always welcome, fantastic. And when you speak of tokenism, you speak of, I think a good example could be the repatriation of African artifacts. You know, why is it taking this long? Why is there such a debate if the intentions are absolutely true? Why don't you just return them? You know, it's a different debate that should not come to the fore, especially when your reasons that there is the concept of an encyclopedic museum, or that the Africans themselves cannot take care of the works. I think that is secondary when you first consider who owns these pieces, first of all. And if your intention is to continue to have important relations, you know, and shared history with Africa, and of course, to build trade and opportunities, why don't you start with a soft power by returning what rightfully belongs to the Africans that were taking, in outright theft? So that, for me, is a fine example.
Absolutely, completely agree. Well, thank you so much. I mean, there's a lot of food for thought there, and this conversation, I think, does need to continue. But I would like to really thank all the guests for coming, all the fantastic questions. There's been a lot of positive comments, and I hope you've been, reading the text coming in, people really supporting and saying we have to create our own art and tourism industry. A lot of amazing comments coming through. Satellites of Arts does seek to promote a lot more that discourse and platforms and dialogues and cooperation. So if people can just, keep track of the websites and all the social media, there is going to be a lot of activity and interaction, and also trying to really listen to what, I've been taking notes, really listen to what has been discussed here and see how people can collaborate together. It's also bringing people together, on this platform and connecting people to kind of move those things forward. So many of the things that have been spoken about, whether it's education, curriculum, just really thinking, okay, what can we do to support that? Or what can we, where can we help with the mentorship? Or what can we do with, patronage? Just various aspects. Yes, there's the commercial aspect of art, but there's also, particularly in Satellites of Art, there's also the philanthropic, sort of more, developmental aspect of really supporting the industry in this part of the world. So, so let's all stay in touch and focus. And I really would like to thank you both, and from the bottom of my heart, and all the viewers and people who attended on a Thursday evening for such a wonderful, profound and insightful discussion. I've certainly had a lot of insights and really reflected and really learned a lot from this discussion. There's been a lot of issues that have come up that I hadn't really considered before, a lot of deep issues. So thank you very much for your time and your insights. I'd really like to thank you so much for that, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
And I'm happy to meet Oliver because I've heard about him. I've never really met him. So this is a wonderful.
Same here, Odile. So I'm happy to make your acquaintance, and I hope that we can collaborate in future and taking this forward.
You guys connect. This is the whole
point.
Yeah,
we are connected now.
No doubt about it.
No
doubt about it.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to Louisa, Odile, Tanya, and of course, Aziza. Bless you all.
Yeah, all the best.
All the best. Bye.
Bye.